Ira had not expected to walk to her own death on swollen feet, one hand pressed beneath the weight of a child that was not yet born. But here she was, moving down the long black hall of the Shadow Throne, and every step she took echoed like a question no one in the room wanted answered. The floor was obsidian, polished so dark it gave back no reflection at all, as though the stone had been told to forget the shape of anything that walked across it. Cold rose through the thin soles of her shoes and into her bones. Her breath came out as pale smoke and vanished, and on either side of her, lining the hall in two silent rows, stood the court of Duskmere, generals in Wraithborn and the Grey. Hollow-eyed lords of the dark, and not one of them moved. They were staring at her belly. Era lifted her chin and kept walking, because the moment she stopped, she knew her courage would stop with her. She was 8 months heavy with the heir of Sunhold, the firstborn of the Alpha King, and she had crossed a border that swallowed armies to bring that child into the one throne room in the living world where it was promised to die. The Pact of Ash demanded the heir. She had come to refuse it. She had come to a god of shadows, with nothing but her own thundering heart and the small, stubborn life beneath her ribs, and she intended to tell him no. It was, she understood now, the most insane thing anyone had ever done. The hall stretched on. At the far end, raised on a dais of fused black glass, sat the throne, and the thing the throne was built to hold. She had heard the stories her whole life. Everyone in Sunhold had. The Shadow King did not bleed. The Shadow King did not age. The Wayne that lived in his lands devoured anything with a beating heart that dared to cross his threshold uninvited. Travelers who wandered too close came back as gray dust on the wind, if they came back at all. No supplicant had ever stood before that throne and walked away. He had not spared a single soul in 300 years. Mothers in Sunhold used his name to frighten children into their beds. Hush now, or the Shadow King will hear you. Ira had whispered it herself, once, to a hearth-girl's crying baby, never dreaming that one day she would walk the full and freezing length of his hall to put her own child between them. The cruelty of that was not lost on her. She had spent her whole life being told the dark was the worst thing in the world. And the dark in Sunhold's stories had never once asked for anything as gently as Aldrich's council had asked her to simply hand the baby over and be sensible about it. And as Ira drew closer, she saw it move. It came off the dais like spilled ink running uphill, a darkness with no edges, pouring across the floor toward her, faster than anything that size had any right to move. The court drew a single breath as one. Ira's legs locked. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run. And she knew with perfect clarity that she would not make it 3 steps, so she did the only thing left to a woman with nowhere to go. She wrapped both arms around her stomach, and she stood her ground, and she waited for it to take her. The Wayne reached her feet, and it stopped. Ira looked down, certain she had already died, and simply not noticed. The shadow lapped at the toes of her shoes, like black water at the edge of a shore, and then it recoiled. It drew back from her, curling away as though her skin were aflame it could not bear to touch, hissing along the obsidian as it retreated. Where it pulled back, the floor was no longer black. A faint, impossible warmth glowed up through the stone in the shape of her 2 small feet, gold as a coal, the first color the hall had held in longer than anyone living could remember. Somewhere in the rows of frozen lords, a goblet hit the floor and shattered. No one looked at it. On the throne, the darkness gathered itself, and a shape stood up inside it. He was tall in a way that made the great hall feel suddenly small, broad through the shoulders, draped in something that was less a cloak than a piece of the night that had agreed to follow him. His hair was black. His skin was the gray pale of a man who had not seen the sun in centuries. And his eyes, when they found her, when they fixed on her across that vast and silent room, were the deep, drowning color of water under ice. They should have held nothing. The stories all agreed on that. The Shadow King's eyes were empty. They were not empty now. They were staring at her belly with an expression she had no name for, and it was not hunger, and it was not hate. It was something closer to grief. Severin, King of Duskmere, the most feared being in the breathing world, came down off his throne. He had not done that in living memory. Ira didn't know it, but every wraith in that hall did, and the shock of it moved through them like a wind through wheat. The slight, simultaneous lean, the held breath. He descended the black glass steps one at a time, and the Wayne fled before his boots, peeling back from her in a widening circle of that low gold warmth until she stood in a pool of it, an island of light in an ocean of dark, with a god walking toward her through the cold. He stopped an arm's length away. Up close, he was worse and better than the stories. The exhaustion carved into his face was not the kind that sleep could fix. He looked at her, like she was a word in a language he'd forgotten he knew. "You should be Ash," he said. His voice was low and rough, as though he used it rarely. "Everything that comes here is Ash." Era's mouth had gone dry as bone. But she had walked too far to lose her voice now. "Then I'll be Ash after you heard me," she said, "not before." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of it. His gaze dropped again to the child she carried, and his jaw tightened, and for one long suspended moment the whole of Duskmere seemed to hold still around the two of them, the living woman and the dead king, standing in a circle of gold. The court did not breathe. Tovar, his oldest commander, would say later that he had been certain the king would end her then, the way he ended everything that walked into the dark, and that the only question in his mind had been whether Severin would do it quickly. Instead, the Shadow King simply stood there, close to her warmth, looking down at the swell of her belly as though it were a door he had spent 300 years pretending he could not see. Before it was over, Aldrich, Alpha King, the strongest wolf in the living world, the man who had loved her since they were children, would have lost his Luna forever, but not yet. First, there was the throne. And there was the question no one in that hall could answer. Why had the dark refused to take her? 3 days earlier, Ira had still believed she was going to grow old in Sunhold. She had been born wrong for the place, and she knew it. They had found her on the temple steps, in the dead of winter. A foundling, with no name, no pack scent, and no past, wrapped in a blanket the color of old blood. The priestesses took her in because the cold would have killed her otherwise, and they raised her the way you raise a stray that wandered in out of the snow, fed, sheltered, and never quite belonging. She grew up in the lower halls among the hearth girls and the herb tenders, learning to make herself small, to take up no space, to be useful enough that no one thought to send her away. A foundling did not get to want things. A foundling got to be grateful. Then she turned 19, and the priestesses tested her blood the way they tested every girl of age, and the world tilted on its axis. She was an Emberline, the rarest blood in all the wolf realms, a bloodline thought extinct for 200 years, the line whose mates ran true, whose firstborn were said to be born already strong. Sunhold had not produced a healthy alpha heir in 3 generations, and here, scrubbing pots in the lower halls, was a girl who could give the kingdom one. She went from nobody to Luna elect in the span of a single afternoon. They washed the soot off her, put her in pale gold silk, and walked her up to meet the Alpha King. Ira pressed a hand to the small of her aching back now, and remembered that first meeting, the way you remember something that happened to a different person. Aldrich had been kind. That was the thing no one ever believed when she told it later. The Alpha King of Sunhold, the Golden Wolf, the strongest of his generation, had taken one look at the terrified foundling they'd shoved into his throne room and crossed the floor to take her hand in both of his, and he'd said, low enough that only she could hear, "Whatever they told you about why you're here, forget it. We'll figure it out together. I'm not going to let them frighten you." She had loved him for it. She still loved him, In the worn and complicated way you love someone you've shared 8 years and a marriage and a coming child with. That was what made all of this so unbearable. Because Aldrich had lied, not cruelly, not even knowingly, at first, but he had lied. It was old Bren, the kennel master, who told her the truth. Old Bren, who was half-deaf and three-quarters senile, and who said things to her that no one in their right mind would say to a Luna, because to him, she would always be the soot-faced girl who used to bring him willow tea for his knees. She'd been sitting with him in the warm dark of the kennels, heavy with the coming air, when he'd patted her belly with one gnarled hand and said, sadly, "Ah, little Ember, they'll send the babe down to the dark, same as all the others. Same as the king's own brother, God's rest him. It's the pact, always the pact." Ira had gone very still. What pact? And the old man had blinked at her, and the color had drained from his face as he realized she didn't know. She made him tell her. It took the better part of an hour, and by the end of it, the whole shining structure of her life in Sunhold had quietly collapsed into rubble. 200 years ago, Sunhold had nearly died. Not in war, in the wane, a creeping shadow death that rose out of the southern dark and ate the light out of the land, withering crops, sickening wolves, turning whole villages gray and silent in a single night. Nothing held it back. Nothing, until the Shadow King of Duskmere agreed to take the Wain into his own keeping and hold it far from the living lands, at a price, the Pact of Ash. In exchange for keeping the dark at bay, Duskmere would receive, in every generation, the firstborn heir of Sunhold's Alpha King, given over to the Shadow Court at birth, never to be seen again. For 200 years, Sunhold's kings had paid quietly, in secret. Each firstborn carried south in the night and surrendered to the dark, while the kingdom was told the child had died at birth. Aldrich's own elder brother had been an Ashborn heir. That was why Aldrich was king. That was why Aldrich had been raised to do his duty, and never, ever, question it. And the child beneath Ira's heart, the first true, Emberline heir in 200 years, the strongest the line had ever produced, was the most valuable payment Sunhold had ever owed. She had confronted Aldrich that very night. She would never forget his face. He had not denied it. He had not even tried. He'd sat down heavily on the edge of their bed, put his head in his hands and said, in a voice she'd never heard him use, "If I break the pact, the Wain comes back. It takes everything, every wolf, every child, every soul in Sunhold. I cannot trade a kingdom for one life. Ira, not even his, not even ours." And then, more quietly, the words that broke something in her for good. "I have known since the day they told us you carried him. I'm sorry, I should have told you." I couldn't make myself say it out loud. She had asked him the only question that mattered. "Did you marry me? For me, Aldrich? Or, did you marry me for him?" And she had watched the answer cross his face, a full second before he found the kindness to lie about it. He had loved her, she didn't doubt that. But he had been raised to need an Emberline, the way a king is raised to need an army, and somewhere underneath, the love had always been the arithmetic, the rare blood, the strong air, the debt that blood was born to pay. She had been chosen the way you choose a key, for the lock it happens to fit. She had spent 8 years, grateful, to be wanted, and she had never once stopped to ask wanted, for what? He wept. She believed his grief was real. And it changed nothing at all, because in the morning, he would still be the king who let it happen, and she would still be the mother who didn't. So Ira made her choice. She would not hand her child to the dark and call it duty. She would not sit in a gilded room and wait for them to carry her son away in the night. If the pact demanded the heir, then she would take the heir to the one who held the other end of the bargain, and she would look him in the eye, and she would ask him, a creature out of every nightmare she'd ever been told, to let her baby go. It was suicide. Everyone knew Duskmere was death. She would not survive the crossing, let alone the throne. She knew that. She packed a small bag anyway, in the gray hour before dawn, and she stood at the southern window, looking out at the black line of the Shadowlands on the horizon, one hand cradling the great curve of her belly. "It's just you and me now," she whispered to her son. "I'm sorry it's me. I'm not very much, but I'm all you've got, and I am not giving you up." The baby kicked once, hard, beneath her palm, as if in answer. She thought about leaving Aldrich a note, and found she had nothing to say that wouldn't either damn him or forgive him, and she wasn't ready to do either. So she left him the silence instead. Let the king, who couldn't say the hard thing out loud, spend the rest of his life listening to how quiet the room was without her in it. Heir smiled, blinked back the sting in her eyes, and went to steal a horse. The border of Duskmere announced itself first as silence. Heir had ridden 2 days south, sleeping in ditches, keeping off the roads, certain at every hour that Aldrich's trackers would come thundering up behind her, but they never did, and somehow that was worse, because it meant he had let her go. By the second evening, the birdsong thinned and then stopped. The wind died. The trees, when she reached them, were the wrong color. Bark gone gray as cold ash, leaves curled and silver and utterly still, as though the whole forest had been holding its breath for 100 years. Her stolen horse refused to take another step past the first of those gray trees. It planted its feet, rolled its eyes white, and would not be moved, so Heir slid down off its back, pressed her forehead to its warm neck in thanks, and went on alone, on foot. 8 months, heavy, into the dark. The Wain found her within the hour. She felt it before she saw it, a cold that was not weather, a pressure against her skin like being watched by something with no eyes. Then a fog came rolling low between the gray trunks. Except it wasn't fog, because fog didn't move toward you against the wind, and fog didn't make the small, hungry, listening sound that this did. Heir's heart slammed against her ribs. She backed against a tree, both arms locked around her belly, and watched the dark pour across the ground toward her feet, and she thought, with a strange, flat calm, well, at least it will be quick. The Wain reached her boots, and it stopped, just as it would stop, days later, at the foot of the Shadow Throne, though she had no way of knowing that yet. It curled back from her in that same hissing recoil, and, where it pulled away, the gray moss at her feet flushed faintly, briefly green. Heir stared down at it, uncomprehending, her breath sawing in and out of her. The dark wanted her. She could feel that it wanted her, the way you feel a held breath, and it could not make itself touch her. It was the child. She knew it, the way she knew her own name. He was the thing the dark would not touch. The strongest emberline air in 200 years, the light the shadow had been promised and had never yet been allowed to swallow. Her son was holding back the Wain from the inside, and so long as she carried him, the dark could not have her. Heir began to laugh, half hysterical, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Oh," she breathed to her belly, tears running freely now. "Oh, you clever thing. You wonderful, terrible, clever thing." She walked the rest of the way into Duskmere, inside a moving circle of green and gold, and the Wain parted before her like a curtain the whole way to the gates. It was the strangest pilgrimage in the history of either realm. A pregnant woman in a stolen cloak, walking through a dead country at an aching pace, while 200 years of accumulated darkness drew back from her on every side, and the poisoned ground bloomed faintly under her feet, and died again the moment she passed. She talked to her son the whole way, because the silence frightened her more than the dark did, telling him, fiercely, that she would find him somewhere. No one wanted him for what he could do, and made herself believe it, step by step, all the way to the black gates of the city of the dead. The Shadow Court took her without a fight. They had no idea what to do with her. That much was plain in the way the gray-faced guards fell back from her glow, hissing among themselves, none of them willing to lay a hand on the woman the Wain refused to eat. They surrounded her and herded her weapons, half-raised and useless, all the way through the black city of Duskmere to the Hall of the Throne, and that was where the first chapter of this story had found her. Walking the long obsidian floor toward the most feared being in the world, waiting to be turned to dust. While the dark recoiled from her feet, and a dead king came down off his throne to ask her why she wasn't already ash. Now Ira stood in her island of gold light, an arm's length from Severin of Duskmere, and discovered that she had run entirely out of plan. She'd had a speech. She'd practiced it for 2 days on the back of a stolen horse. Every word of it had fled the instant those ice-water eyes settled on her, and what came out of her mouth instead, in the ringing silence of that hall, was, "Are you going to turn me to ash or not? Because I've come a very long way, and I'd at least like to sit down first." The court made a sound, a low, scandalized rustle, the sound of 100 wraiths who had never once heard a living thing speak to their king that way and expect to keep its tongue. Severin's head tilted, slowly, the way a predator's does when something unexpected refuses to flee. "You walk into my hall," he said, "carrying a debt my realm has been owed for 200 years. And you ask me for a chair. I'm asking you for a great deal more than a chair," Ira said. Her voice shook. "She let it. But my feet are killing me, and I'm carrying your 200 years debt up a very long room, so I thought we might start small." For one terrible heartbeat, nothing happened. She watched his hand, half-shadow itself, the dark clinging to his long fingers like wet silk, and she thought of every story she'd ever heard, of supplicants turned to ash mid-word, and she made herself hold his gaze anyway. "If I look away," she thought, "I'm dead." He spent 300 years watching things look away from him. Then Severin turned his head a fraction and said, "To the heir, bring her a chair." Nothing in that hall had ever moved so fast. A great carved seat was hauled forward out of the shadows by 2 wraith lords, who looked as though they'd been asked to commit a crime, and sat down in the middle of her pool of gold light, and Ira lowered herself into it with a groan of pure animal relief that, under literally any other circumstances, she would have been mortified by. The baby shifted, the light around her brightened, then settled. Severin watched all of it with that drowning, unreadable gaze. He had not stepped out of the circle of warmth her body cast across the floor. She noticed. He stood at the very edge of it, half in her gold and half in his own dark, and something about the way he held himself there, leaning very slightly in, like a man standing close to a fire on a winter night, made her chest go strangely tight. "You felt that," she said before she could stop herself. "When I came near, you felt it." His face shuddered like a slammed door. "I feel nothing." "You're a terrible liar," Ira said, "for a god," and watched, astonished as the king of Duskmere, who did not bleed, who did not age, who had not been surprised by anything in 300 years, went briefly, furiously silent. Like a man who did not have an answer ready, and was not used to needing one. From the shadows at the side of the hall, a tall, gray-armored figure, with a commander's bearing, stepped half a pace forward, his eyes moving between his king and the glowing woman in the chair with an expression of dawning, careful alarm. Ira would later learn his name was Tovar, and that he had served Severin for 90 years, and that in all that time he had never once seen what he was seeing now. "My king," Tovar said quietly. "The Wain." "No." "Look at the Wain." Severin turned. All around the great dark hall, where the shadow had pooled, thick and restless against the walls, for as long as any of them had stood there, the Wain had gone still, not retreating, still settled low and quiet and almost peaceful, the way a fevered animal finally stops thrashing, soothed for the first time in 200 years by the small gold light of a foundling girl and the child she would not give up. Severin stared at it, and for the first time, the look on his face was not grief and was not hunger. It was hope, and it terrified him more than anything had in 300 years. They did not set her free either. They put her in a tower. It was, Ira had to admit, a very nice tower, high in the black spires of Duskmere, with a real bed and a hearth that someone had stocked with pale, coal-burning wood, and a window that looked south over the gray deadlands toward the faint green smudge of the living world she'd left behind. The door was not locked. It didn't need to be. There was nowhere in all of Duskmere a heavily pregnant woman could run, and they both knew it. She was a guest, the way a held breath is a gift, kept and waited on, and watched. The one who watched her was an old woman named Orsa. She came on the first morning with a tray and a sharp, sideways look, and she did not bow, and she did not flinch from Ira's lingering glow, which, after 2 days of wraiths recoiling from her like she was a torch, was such a relief that Ira nearly wept. Orsa was small and bent and gray as everything else in that place, but her eyes were black and bright, and entirely too knowing, and she set the tray down, planted herself in the room's one other chair, and announced, "So? You're the one the dark won't eat. You're younger than I expected, and ruder, by what I hear." "I've had a difficult week," Ira said. Orsa barked a laugh, surprised out of her. After that, something eased between them. The old woman was a seer, the last of the Shadow Court's blood readers, she said, though she made a face, when she said court, as though the word tasted of dust. She had served in Duskmere longer than she would say, and had stopped counting the years a long time ago. And over the days that followed, as Ira's strength came back and her belly grew and the strange settled quiet held over Duskmere like a withheld storm, it was Orsa who began, piece by reluctant piece, to tell her the truth of where she actually was. "You think you came here to bargain with a monster," Orsa said one gray afternoon, grinding something bitter-smelling in a stone bowl while Ira watched from the window. "You came here to bargain with a dying one." Ira went still. "What?" "The Wayne." Orsa set the bowl down. Her bright black eyes fixed on Ira's, and there was no cruelty in them, only a terrible old tiredness. "What do you think it is, girl? Where do you think it lives? You walked through 200 miles of it to reach this hall. You felt it want you. Did it ever once feel to you like a thing apart from him?" The cold that went through Ira had nothing to do with the room. "It's in him," she whispered. "The Wayne. It's not something he holds back. It's something he holds inside. It is him and he is it, and it has been eating him alive by inches for 300 years. Orsa's voice was flat and quiet. "That is the pact your sunlit kings never understood. He didn't cage the dark to save your lands. He swallowed it. 300 years ago, when the Wayne rose loose and the world was ending, the man on that throne took it into his own body so it would have somewhere to live that wasn't the world, and he has carried it and held it and been slowly devoured by it, alone in the dark, ever since. So that you and yours could sleep safe under your golden sun and never know his name." She spat neatly into the cold fire. "And every 20 years or so, the dark grows too strong and too hungry, and it has to be fed and quieted, or it will break its banks and pour out across the world. That is what the heirs were for, child, not servants, not hostages." Ira's hand had gone to her belly. She felt sick. "Food," she said. "The heirs were food for the Wayne, the strongest light given to the deepest dark, to keep it sleeping a little longer." Orsa looked at her almost gently. "Your sun is the brightest light the Emberline has produced in 200 years. With him, the dark would sleep for 100. Severin would have his first century of peace since he took the throne." She paused. "It is why he should have taken you the moment you walked into his hall. It is the one thing that could save him. And instead, the fool came down off his throne and called for a chair." The room was very quiet. Out the window, the gray land stretched away to the south. Ira looked down at the faint gold light, her own skin still cast across the stone floor, and a bitter, exhausted understanding settled over her. "So I'm a key again," she said, half to herself. "That's all I've ever been to anyone. The right blood, the right cargo. Sunhold wanted me for the heir I could make, and your king wants me for the heir I could feed him." She laughed, and it came out wet and wrong. 200 miles. And I walked from one man who needs my child to another. I should be used to it by now. Orsa studied her for a long moment with those bright black eyes. She said, and there was something careful in it. And yet, the one who needs your child is, this very moment, refusing to take it, refusing to even come near you for fear of what he might do. You might ask yourself what that is, if not need. She let the thought hang there, unkind only in its honesty. But that is his trouble to untangle. Yours is simpler and worse. How long does he have? Ira heard herself ask. If he doesn't feed it, Orsa was silent. For a long moment. He hides it well. Pride. He has always had too much of it. Right to the edge of the end. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron. But I have read his blood since before your grandmother drew breath. And I know the signs of an ending. And I see them on him now. The dark is winning. It has been winning for years. Her bright eyes met Ira's and held them. A year perhaps, likely less. And when he falls at last, with no one to take the wane after him, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. It pours out, Ira said softly. Into the world, all of it. Into the world, all of it. Orsa rose, gathered her bowl, and shuffled toward the door, an old woman with old knees. But she stopped at the threshold, and she looked back, and for the first time, the knowing brightness in her eyes had something in it that might almost have been pity. So you see your trouble, Luna of Sunhold. You came here to save one child from the dark, and you have walked instead into the heart of a dying god, carrying the only thing in all the world that could either save him or finish him for good. She opened the door, and the dark settled the moment you walked in. 200 years, and it has never once gone quiet. Until you. She paused. I would think very hard, if I were you, about why that is. Because he is upstairs, thinking about nothing else. The door closed behind her. Ira sat alone in the high coal tower, with her hand pressed to her unborn son, looking south toward a home that would carry her child into this same dark if she ever went back, and north, up through the black stone over her head, toward a king who could end her with a thought and had called for a chair instead. And somewhere far above her, in a room she could not see, the most feared being in the living world stood at his own window, looking down at the faint gold light leaking from the tower beneath him. The first warmth he had felt in 300 years of cold, and made himself a quiet, iron promise that he would die before he let himself reach for it. He had done the arithmetic, too. He had done it the instant the dark refused her at the foot of his throne. One woman, one child, against 100 years of peace and a kingdom's worth of souls. It was not even a difficult sum. Any king worth the name would have made the trade and slept soundly after. That was what frightened him. Not that he couldn't bring himself to do it, but that for the first time in 3 centuries, sitting in the dark with the math laid out plain before him, he had found something he wanted more than the ending of his own pain. He did not have a name for it yet. He suspected that when he found one, it would cost him everything. He did not yet know how badly he was going to break that promise. For 3 days after the throne room, Ira did not see the Shadow King at all. She saw the proof of him everywhere in the trays. The wraith servants left outside her door and fled from before she could open it, in the way the black corridors went silent when Orsa walked her out for air, in the single living vine that had begun impossibly to climb the dead trellis beneath her tower window, reaching up through the gray toward her gold light like a plant following the sun. But the king himself kept his distance. Orsa said he was occupied in a tone that made the word sound like a wound. Tuvar, when Ira glimpsed him in the halls, wore the face of a man watching a frozen river he did not trust to hold. She understood why, on the 3rd night, when the screaming started. It came up through the floor of her tower, a little after midnight. Not a human sound, not entirely, but low and vast and terrible. The sound a mountain might make if a mountain could grieve. the cold came with it. Frost bloomed across the inside of her window, in the space of a breath, and the gold light of her skin guttered like a candle in a draught, and beneath her ribs the baby went rigid and still in a way that frightened her more than any noise could. Heir was on her feet and at the door before she decided to move. Tovar was already there, fist raised to knock, his gray face stripped of its usual composure. "Luna," he said. He had never called her that before. "I would not ask. I have nowhere else to go." "What is it?" she breathed. "What's happening?" "It's the turning." His jaw worked. Every so often, the dark in him wakes hungry, and he holds it, alone, the way he has always held it. But it is worse now. Every year it is worse. The sound rose again below them, and Tovar flinched, and Heir saw with a jolt that the old commander's eyes were wet. 90 years, I have stood outside that door and listened to my king fight it alone. Tonight the dark is winning, and the only thing in this whole dead country it has flinched from in 2 centuries is you." She did not make him ask again. They went down through the black spires at a run, or what passed for a run, for a woman 8 months heavy, one hand braced under her belly, Tovar's grip steadying her elbow on the icy stairs. The screaming grew louder, the lower they went, and the cold grew worse, and the rain began to pool out of the walls into the stairwell, thick and churning and wrong reaching for them, and then recoiling, hissing, from the light she cast, so that they descended in a moving bubble of warmth down a throat of living dark. The doors at the bottom were iron and frost-white, and standing open. Inside, the King of Duskmere was on his knees on the floor of his own chamber, and the dark was eating him alive. That was the only way Heir could think to name it. The rain had risen off the walls and the floor, and poured itself into him, pouring in through his eyes and his open mouth, and the clenched lines of his hands, and he was fighting it the way a drowning man fights water. Silently now, the screaming spent, every muscle in his great frame, locked, rigid against a tide that was pulling him under from the inside. His skin had gone the gray-black of a dead coal. Tendrils of shadow lashed off him and struck the walls, and in the half-second before he sensed her, Heir saw his face clearly, and what was written there was not rage, and was not even pain. It was permission. He was letting it take him. He was a man on his knees deciding at last to stop holding the door. "No," Heir said. "Oh, no you don't." She crossed the room. Tovar shouted something, a warning, her name, but the dark drew back from her with every step, peeling off the king in great reluctant ribbons as her light reached him, and she did the only thing her body knew how to do. Which was the thing she had done her whole life, for every sick and frightened creature the lower halls had ever sent her. She knelt down in front of him, took his cold face in both her warm hands and said, low and steady, "Look at me. I'm here. Look at me, you stubborn thing. Come back." His eyes opened. They were full of dark. And then, where her gold light touched them, they weren't. The shadow drained out of them like floodwater finding a crack, receding from his face, his throat, his hands, sinking back down into the stone and the walls, quiet again, fed without being fed, soothed by nothing but the nearness of the child she carried and the light it lent her skin. Severin knelt before her, gray and shaking and alive, and stared at her from a handspan away as though she were something that should not be able to exist. "You should not have come down here," he rasped. "You're welcome," said Heir. A sound came out of him that she would not, for several days, let herself believe had been a laugh. That was how the arrangement began, though no one called it that, and no one wrote it down, and Severin agreed to none of it out loud. But the next night, when the cold crept up through her floor again, Tovar did not have to come for her. She was already dressed, and when she let herself into the king's chamber and settled into the great chair someone had placed without comment beside his cold hearth, the wains sank low and went still, and the King of Duskmere, who had not closed his eyes in the presence of another living soul in 300 years, sat in the dark across the room from her, and slowly, warily, like a wolf lying down within sight of a fire. He let his shoulders come down from around his ears. "You don't have to talk to me," he said gruffly, the third night. "Oh good," said Ira, "because I have a great deal to say," and she told him, at length, about the vine on the trellis, and the wraith who kept leaving her 2 spoons and no knife, and the way his entire terrifying court fled from her like she was on fire, and somewhere in the middle of it she felt, rather than saw, the hard line of his mouth ease just slightly in the dark. He answered in single words, when he answered at all, but he listened. She could tell by the small silences that opened in the right places, by the way his head turned when she said something that surprised him. It was the conversation of a man who had forgotten the shape of one, relearning it a syllable at a time. So, she kept on, night after night, until the doing of it stopped feeling like courage and started feeling like the only sane thing in a kingdom of the dead. It was on the 5th night that she first slipped into the hush. She hadn't meant to. She dozed in the chair, lulled by the quiet and the late hour, her hand resting on the arm of it, and somehow in sleep, that hand had found his where it gripped the chair beside her, and the moment her warm fingers closed over his cold ones, the chamber dissolved. She stood in a vast gray waste under a starless sky. Ash fell like snow, endless and soundless, and a wind moved across a plain that went on forever, without a single living thing on it, except that it was not empty. Figures stood in the ash, hundreds of them, thousands, still as gravestones, gray from head to foot, their faces turned toward a horizon that held no light. The wind wore them away by grains, she realized with dawning horror. They were being slowly unmade, one drifting mote at a time, and they did not move, and they did not cry out. Because in this place there was no sound at all. That was the worst of it. The silence was total. The hush ate every noise the instant it was made. She turned, and Severin stood behind her, gray as the rest, staring out at the standing figures with the dead permission back in his eyes. And then she looked again at the figures nearest her, and her heart stopped. They were small, the ones in the front row, closest to the wearing wind, the oldest, the most worn. They were small, child-sized. Gray children standing motionless in the falling ash, being unmade grain by grain by grain, their small faces turned patiently toward a horizon that would never lighten. Ira's hand flew to her belly. She tried to scream, and the hush swallowed it whole. She woke with a wrench, back in the chair. The king's hand torn from hers, her own scream, finally finding air, and Severin was already across the room, his back to her, both palms flat against the cold stone wall, and his head bowed between his arms. He did not turn around. His voice was flat and dead, and very quiet. "I felt you there. I have never, no one has ever followed me down. You saw them." Those were children. Ira's whole body was shaking. Those were children. Yes. The heirs. She could barely say it. The Ashbourne heirs. 200 years of Sunhold's firstborn. That's where they are. That's where that is where I put them. He turned, finally, and the look on his face was the loneliest thing she had ever seen on a living creature. "You wanted the truth of your child's fate, Luna. There it is. The dark must be fed, or it drowns the world. The strongest light buys the longest quiet. For 200 years, the kings of Sunhold sent me their brightest children, and for 200 years I carried them down into the hush, and I gave them to the wind, one by one, so that your people could keep their son." His hands had curled into fists at his sides. "I told myself it was mercy that I learned their names. I told myself it mattered that someone remembered them. It does not matter. I am the thing that took them. That is what I am. That is all I am. And you have been sitting in my chamber every night holding the hand that did it." The silence rang. Ira thought she might be sick. She thought of the gray children, the patient little faces, and she thought of the warm kicking weight beneath her own heart. And for one vertiginous moment, the two of them, The monster's confession and the mother's terror pulled her in two opposite directions at once. And then, slowly, the thing Orsa had said came back to her. The one who needs your child is, this very moment, refusing to take it. You stopped, Ira said. Severin went still. My son. She pressed her hand flat to her belly. The brightest light the Ember Line has made in 200 years. By your own arithmetic, he'd buy you a century. He walked into your hall days ago in his mother's body, and the dark went quiet for the first time in living memory. And you didn't take him. She rose out of the chair, unsteady, fierce. You came down off your throne and you called for a chair. You've spent every night since keeping the whole width of the room between us, so you wouldn't have to be near the thing that could save you. That's not what a monster does, Severin. A monster would have given him to the dark that first hour and slept 100 years. Do not, he said, very low. Make me into something gentle. People who do that get hurt. I'm not making you anything, her voice cracked. I'm telling you what I see. He looked at her for a long, long moment, and something in his ruined face came perilously close to breaking, and then he mastered it, the way she imagined he had mastered everything for 300 years, and turned away. But he did not send her out. And when she sank back into the chair, exhausted, he came, after a long while, warily, and sat on the cold hearthstones near her feet, not touching, close enough that the Wayne stayed quiet, and the two of them kept a strange and silent vigil until the gray dawn. A rhythm formed after that, the way water finds a channel. In the daylight hours, she rarely saw him. The king had a dying realm to hold together, and she had a child to grow, and Orsa to spar with, and the slow gray garden beneath her window that bloomed a little greener every time she sat in it. But when the cold came in the deep of the night, she went down, and the dark went quiet. And Severin, by inches, by grudging fractions, began to rest. He never said thank you, but things appeared. The chamber's south shutter, which had been nailed closed for a century, was quietly pried open one night, so that from her chair she could see the same faint green smudge of the living lands she watched from her tower. He had noticed, without a word, that she looked for it. The two spoons no-knife wraith was replaced by one who brought alongside her supper the small, bitter southern oranges that grew nowhere in Duskmere, and must have cost someone a dangerous journey to find. And one night she came down to discover that the great, cold hearth, dark for 3 centuries, had been laid with pale wood and lit for her, because she got cold, because the king of the Shadowlands had apparently dispatched someone to learn how a living woman likes to be warm. You lit a fire, she said, absurdly moved. It was already there, said Severin, who was a worse liar than any god had a right to be, and Ira hid her smile in the dark. It became, she realized later, the happiest stretch of her whole strange life, that a foundling carrying a doomed child into the heart of a dying god's country should find, in that cold black tower, the first place she had ever felt entirely safe. No one there wanted anything from her she had to perform. No council watched her belly and calculated. The wraiths had stopped fleeing and started in their gray, silent way to tend her. And every night the king of all of it sat near her in the firelight and let her feel the unbearable quiet, and listened like the listening cost him nothing and meant everything. She told him things, on those nights, about the temple steps and the blood test and the gold silk, about being a foundling who learned young to want nothing, take up no space, be useful enough that no one sent her away. I was never Ira to any of them, she said once, watching the fire. I was an Ember Line. I was the right blood, the strong heir, the key that fit the lock. Even Aldrich. And he was kind, he was always kind. Even he loved me with the arithmetic running underneath the whole time. I spent 8 years grateful to be wanted, and I never once let myself ask what for. She laughed, low and not quite steady. Turns out, it was for exactly the same thing you want me for. The child, always the child. Nobody's ever wanted the woman carrying it. Severin was quiet for so long, she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he said into the dark, I have not thought about your child in 4 nights. Ira turned her head. When you are in the room, he said slowly, like a man stepping onto ice, I do not think about the hush, or the wind, or the 100 years of quiet. I think about whether you are warm enough. I think about the orange. You did not finish. I think that you talk too much, and that the silence is unbearable on the nights you are not here. He was staring fixedly at the fire, his jaw tight, as though the words were being pulled out of him with hooks. 300 years, Luna. I have known exactly what I am worth, down to the last grain. I am worth the dark I carry. No more than that, and no king of Sunhold ever pretended otherwise, and I never once asked them to. He drew a slow breath. And then a rude woman walked up my hall and refused to be Ash, and sat in my cold room and looked at the worst thing in the world as though it were only tired. So you are wrong, Luna, about no one wanting the woman. You are wrong about that. The fire popped. Outside, the impossible vine had reached the sill of the south window. And Ira became aware, all at once, of the thing she had been refusing to name for 5 nights. The pull. The low, constant, bone-deep awareness of him that followed her through every hour, the ache that opened in her chest on the daylit afternoons they spent apart, the way her wolf, silent her whole life, cowed and small like the rest of her, had begun to stir in the presence of a dead king she had every reason in the world to fear. She was mated. She wore Aldrich's bond like a ring. She could not take off. A wolf bonded once, and only once, and forever. So this, whatever this was, this gravity, this terrible gladness, could not be that. She was still telling herself so, when she felt the bond to Aldrich, the old familiar thread that had tied her to Sunhold for 8 years, give the faintest, quietest fray. She went to Orsa about it, because she did not dare go to Severin. A mate bond doesn't fray, Ira said. She was pacing the Sears' cramped, herb-hung room, one hand pressed to the small of her back. It can't. That's the whole point of it. It's the one fixed thing in a wolf's life. So either I'm imagining it, or it was never a true bond at all, said Orsa, without looking up from her grinding. Ira stopped pacing. Sit down before you fall down. The old woman set the pestle aside and fixed her with those bright, black eyes. Think, girl. Your golden king married you in a great hall with 1,000 witnesses because a council of advisors tested your blood and told him to, a bond made of should and strategy, and a frightened young king doing his duty. Strong, yes. Real, in its way. But struck like a bargain, not. She made a sharp gesture, fingers snapping shut. Not taken. The way the old bonds were taken, when the wolf knows its own before the mind has any say in the matter. Her gaze dropped, pointedly, to the curve of Ira's belly, and then rose, just as pointedly, toward the black spire above them, where a dying king sat alone, whereas the dark in this whole country has flinched from exactly one woman in 200 years. And the woman, I notice, cannot stop watching the stairs. I'm mated, Ira whispered. It came out like a plea. I'm carrying another man's child. I'm the last thing in the world that he's a king, Orsa. He could have anything, anyone, and I'm a foundling with someone else's son under my heart, and a bond I can't even, and there it is. Orsa's voice was not unkind. 300 years, that one upstairs, has believed he is good for nothing but giving children to the dark. And his whole life, this one down here has believed she is good for nothing but the children she can make for better people than herself. She shook her head slowly. Gods, help me. The two of you? A matched set of people who each think they're the only thing in the room not worth saving. She rose with a grunt, crossed to Eira, and took the younger woman's chin in one gnarled hand, firmly, without an ounce of calculation in it. Hear me, because I'll say it once. I have read his blood, for longer than your whole line has drawn breath, and I have never seen the dark do what it has done. Since you walked through that gate, it did not merely spare you, it settled. For 200 years that thing has been a wound that would not close, and a slip of a girl from the temple steps walked in, and it stopped bleeding. That is not the child, whatever the arithmetic says. 100 Emberline babes have gone into that dark, and only quieted it. You healed it, and the dark knows the difference, even if you're too frightened to. She let go. The bond is taking, child, whether either of you has the courage to call it by its name. And the more it takes, the more the other one frays. You did not break your vow to your golden king. Something older than your vow is simply telling you the truth. The only question left is what you mean to do about it before it pulls you both apart. Ira did not get to answer. The cold came early that night. Hours early. Wrong. Vicious. It came up through the seer's floor, mid-sentence, frost racing across the stones, and far above them the terrible grieving sound began again, days ahead of its turning, and Ira was already moving, already running, because she understood now in her bones what the others only feared. The dark was not waiting for its schedule anymore. The dark had decided it wanted her, and the child and the light. Now, and it was tearing at the man who stood between them to get it. She found him on his knees again, worse than the first night. The Wayne had him to the chest already pouring in, and Tovar and 3 Wraith Lords were braced against the chamber doors holding back a tide of shadow that wanted out into the world. And the whole black spire was groaning around them like a ship in a storm. Severin, she threw herself down in front of him, took his face, and this time he wrenched back from her hands. No, he gasped. The dark was in his teeth. Get out. Get out. Ira. Don't you dare, she sobbed, reaching for him again. Don't you dare give it permission. I'm right here. It's not the turning. He caught her wrists before she could touch him, and his grip was iron, and his eyes, fighting up through the black, were wild with a terror that had nothing to do with himself. Don't you understand? Every night, you are near me. It grows quiet, and every night, it grows quiet. It grows cunning. It has stopped fighting me. It's learned there is something brighter in this room than anything I've fed it in 200 years, and it will tear down this whole kingdom and me with it to reach what's under your heart. His hands were shaking. It is not safe. You are the thing that is no longer safe. The longer you stay, the more it wants him, and the day comes soon when I will not be strong enough to keep it from simply taking him. And I will not. His voice broke, utterly. I will not be the thing that takes your child too. I would rather it took me first. Do you hear me? I would rather it took me. Then we find another way, she begged. Orsa says, the bond, Severin, there's a bond. We can. There is no we. He thrust her back hard, away from him, away from the rising dark, and surged to his feet with the last of whatever he had left, holding the Wayne down by main force. Gray and shaking and magnificent, and breaking her heart, Tovar will take you to the western gate. There is a refuge in the high passes the dark cannot reach, cold and poor and far. But the child will be born safe and free, and no one's not. Sunhold's, not mine, not its. His ruined eyes found hers one last time, and the worst of it, the thing she would carry for the rest of her life, was how gently he said it. You came here to save your son from a fate in the dark. I am the dark. Ira, let me do this one thing right. Go, Severin. Don't. His voice cracked straight down the middle. For one terrible second, the king was gone entirely, and what stood in his place was only a man, 300 years tired, watching the one good thing that had ever wandered into his cold country, and knowing he had to throw it back out into the snow with his own hands. If you stay, it takes him. And if it takes him, there is no version of me left that survives having let it. You are not saving me by staying. Ira. You are choosing how I die. He dragged in a breath that shook. So let me die having done one thing that wasn't surrendering a child to the dark. Let me die having sent one of them home. That's an order from the King of Duskmare, he said, and turned his back on her, and gave the whole of himself to holding the door. The last one I'll ever give you. Severin. But Tovar's hand had already closed around her arm, and the old commander was weeping openly now, gray tears on a gray face, even as he dragged her bodily backward toward the doors. He's right, Luna, Tovar said brokenly. Gods forgive me. He's right. If you stay, we lose them both. Come, come, she fought him, clawing toward the king on his knees, screaming Severin's name into a silence that was beginning, horribly, to eat the sound of it, the way the hush ate everything. But Tovar was strong, and she was 8 months heavy, and the dark was rising, and in the end he lifted her off her feet and carried her out, and the iron doors boomed shut between her and the only place she had ever felt safe. And the last thing Ira saw, in the half-second before the doors closed, was the gold light of her own body receding up the dark stairs, and the Wain, freed of it, unfreed of the only mercy it had known in 200 years, surging up the king's bowed back like a black wave, finally meeting an undefended shore. The doors shut, the light went with her, and behind them in the dark, with no one left to call him back, Severin stopped holding the door. The road west was a slow unmaking, and Eira felt every mile of it in her bones. Tovar drove the wagon hard through the dead gray country, north and west, away from the black spires, toward the high, cold passes where the dark could not reach. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. And with every turn of the wheels that carried her farther from Duskmere, something inside Ira stretched thinner and thinner, like a thread drawn out past its breaking. The new thing, the taking thing, the bond Orsa had named, pulled tight between her chest and a king she had left on his knees in the dark. It hurt. Not the way grief hurts, the way a wound hurts. By the first nightfall, she could not sit upright. By the second, she could not keep down water, and the baby, who had kicked and turned beneath her heart every hour since she'd left Sunhold, had gone ominously, terribly still. The gold light of her skin, which had blazed bright enough to part an ocean of dark, had dimmed to the faintest ember. It was not only her body that the leaving unmade. With every mile, the old foundling's voice crept back, the one that had whispered to her on the temple steps, and never entirely gone quiet. Of course, he sent you away. You were never the woman. You were only ever the light, and the moment it cost him, he let you go. The same as everyone always has. She knew it was a lie. She had heard him say so, in the firelight, in a voice that had cost him everything. But pain makes old lies loud, and so she lay in the back of a wagon in the dead gray country, and believed the worst about herself, because believing the worst was the only thing she had ever truly been good at. It's killing me, she said to Tovar, somewhere in the gray hours of the second night. Her voice was a thread. Leaving him? It's killing me. And the baby, Tovar, the baby's gone quiet. I know. The old commander's face was carved with misery. A taking bond does not care for distance, Luna. It only knows that half of it is being pulled away from the other half. And it fights. It will fight until one of you stops. He stared at the dead road. He is worse. I can feel it from here, and I am only his soldier. Whatever you feel, he feels it doubled, and the dark is using it. It always uses the cracks. Then turn around, she begged. I can't. He ordered you to save a woman and a child, Eris said, and you are watching both of us die in the back of a wagon. Tovar's hands tightened white on the reins, but he did not turn the wagon. He had served his king for 90 years, and obedience was the last load-bearing wall in a soul the dark had hollowed out long ago, and he could not even now make himself pull it down, so they drove on. And Ira, too weak to fight him, too weak even to weep, closed her eyes against the gray, and the fraying bond, stretched past all bearing, did the only thing left to it, It pulled her down into the hush. She did not arrive gently this time. She fell. The falling had no bottom, and then she stood in the endless ash under the starless sky, the wind screaming, except the hush ate all sound. So she felt the scream in her teeth, rather than heard it. The standing figures had crowded inward, and at the center of them, on his knees, in the gray, was Severin. The dark had nearly finished him. It poured into him from every side, and he was not fighting it at all anymore. He knelt with his arms open and his head bowed, and let it come, and the look on his gray face was something worse than despair. It was relief. The relief of a man finally setting down a weight he had carried for 300 years. And kneeling in front of him, small and gray and patient, holding his ruined face in two child-sized hands the way Ira had once held it herself, was a little girl. "You've held on so long," the child was saying. Her voice was the only sound the hush allowed, soft and gentle and unbearably kind. "You can stop now. You can rest. You gave me to the dark to save them all, and you were only a boy, and you have hated yourself every single night since, and you have given the dark everything you had trying to make it right. And it is enough, Severin. Let it take you. Come and be gray with me. We can finally be together, in the quiet." "Senna," Severin breathed, and the name broke in half coming out of him. Ira understood everything in a single vertiginous rush. The first Ashborn. 300 years ago, when the wane rose loose and devouring and the world was ending, the only cage strong enough to hold it had to be built inside a living soul, and sealing that cage had demanded a sacrifice of the brightest light there was. A child, and the boy they had just put on the shadow throne. Barely a man, terrified, holding the survival of every realm in his shaking hands, had been made to choose. And the brightest light within his reach, the one the binding took, the first of the long gray rows of children he would give up, across 3 centuries, to keep the cage shut, had been his little sister, the child he had raised. The one good thing he'd had. He had given Senna to the dark to save the world. And he had been her warden, and her only company, and the one who had handed her to the dark, every night for 300 years. And he had never once forgiven himself, because how could a person forgive that? So, when the dark whispered that he deserved to be devoured, he agreed. He had always agreed. That was the wound the wane had been pouring its poison into. All along, not a curse laid on him from outside, but the one already inside, the truest, oldest belief of his heart. I am the boy who fed his sister to the dark. I deserve everything that is happening to me. And now, she understood the rest of it too. The thing that made her own chest seize with recognition. The long gray rows of children. 200 years of Sunhold's stolen heirs. He had not given them up the way a tyrant disposes of his enemies. He had carried each of them down into the hush himself, learned their names, and set them beside Senna so that none of them would ever be alone in the gray the way he had let her be alone for the first 100 years before he understood. He had turned his crime into a vigil, made the worst place in all the world into the only thing he had left to give: company. It was the saddest, most broken kind of love Ira had ever seen, and the dark had been feeding on it for 3 centuries, twisting his own tenderness into proof that he was a monster. And the thing wearing Senna's gentle face, murmuring its terrible mercy, Ira saw it now, clear as the gold light dying in her own chest, was not Senna at all. It was the dark. It had taken the shape of the one wound he could not defend, and it was speaking his own verdict back to him in the voice he could least refuse, and he was believing it, the way he had believed it, for 300 years. "That's not her," Ira tried to scream into the soundless waste. "Severin, that's not Senna. That's the dark. Don't listen to it. Those are your words, not hers." The hush swallowed it whole. He could not hear her. She was a guttering ember 1,000 miles away in the back of a wagon, and he was kneeling in the ash with his arms open. And the false child was leaning in to press her gray forehead to his, and the dark gathered itself for the last of him. And Ira, with the very last of her strength, did not scream. She reached across all the dead gray distance, down the thread of the fraying bond. She reached for him the way you reach for someone falling. And she felt, at the far end of it, the faintest answering pull, a king's gray hand closing weakly around hers in the dark. Then she was wrenched up and out, gasping, back into the wagon, back into her failing body, and Tovar was shouting her name, and the wheels had stopped. "Turn it around," Ira rasped, already trying to rise. Gold sputtering back into her skin, the baby kicking hard and frantic against her ribs at last. He gave the dark his sister, Tovar, 300 years ago, when he was a child himself, and he's been letting it eat him for it ever since. He's not being killed, he's agreeing to die. And the only person who can tell him he's wrong is the one he just ordered you to drive away. So turn this wagon around. For one heartbeat, Tovar stared at her. 90 years of obedience, warring with something older and better. Then he wrenched the horses around so hard, the wagon nearly tipped, and they flew back east, into the dark. They reached Duskmere a little before midnight, and the city was screaming. The Wain had broken its banks at last, pouring up out of the black spires in a tide that had already swallowed the western wall. The last memory of color, guttering out wherever it passed. Wraith lords fled before it. Ursa stood at the shattered gate, her old voice raised in some failing ward, and when she saw the wagon come tearing out of the night, with its gold light blazing in the back, the old seer sagged with relief so total it nearly took her off her feet. "He's in the hall?" Ursa cried as Ira half fell from the wagon. "On the throne, where it began. It wants to take him on the throne. Child, it has a taste for endings." Ira was already running. K. She ran through a city, coming apart, through corridors filling with dark, and the Wain reached for her and recoiled, parted, fled, because the light was back, because the brightest thing in 200 years had returned to the one place it had been forbidden, and the dark remembered, and the dark was afraid. She burst into the great hall of the Shadow Throne, the same long obsidian floor she had walked to her death not so many days ago, and at the far end, on the black glass throne, sat Severin, nearly gone, gray to the bone, the Wain pouring into him, the false Senna kneeling at his feet, with her small gray hands on his knees. His drowning eyes found her across the vast dark room, and for a moment, one cracked, disbelieving moment, the dead permission in them faltered. "You were supposed to be safe," he rasped. "I was supposed to be yours," Ira shouted back, and ran the length of the hall, and threw herself down in the gold-lit circle at the foot of the throne. Between the dying king and the thing wearing his sister's face. "Listen to me. Listen. That's not Senna. You know it isn't. Senna was a little girl who loved her brother, and the dark has been wearing her like a mask for 300 years, because it knows it's the one wound you'll never put your shield up against." She seized his cold face in both her blazing hands. "Those words it keeps saying to you, you deserve this, let it take you. Come and be gray." Those aren't her words, Severin. They're yours. It's only ever been your own voice. You built this dark, a mouth, and you've been letting it sentence you with it, every night, for 3 centuries. I gave her to it. His voice was barely there. I was 16. They put the whole world in my hands, and they said, "The cage needs a light," and she was the brightest thing I had. And I chose. Eira, I chose her. What is that, if not a monster? It's a child, Ira wept, being asked to carry something no child should ever carry, and choosing the world and breaking his own heart to do it. And then, spending 300 years standing, watch over the one he lost, because he could not bear to leave her alone in the dark. She pressed her forehead to his. "I know what it is to be the child no one would keep. My own people left me on a temple step in the snow, and for most of my life I believed it was because I was worth leaving, that if I'd been a little brighter, a little more, they'd have stayed. But that was never the truth about me, Severin. It was only the truth about how alone I felt." Her tears fell on his gray skin, and where they fell, faint gold bloomed. You were not a monster at 16. You were a boy in an impossible dark, doing the bravest, most terrible thing anyone ever asked of anyone. And Senna, the real Senna, has been waiting 300 years, not for you to come die with her. She's been waiting for you to forgive yourself and let her rest. The false child at his feet hissed, and its gentle face began to come apart. You don't get to keep punishing yourself by calling it grief, Ira said, fierce now, gripping him. You held the whole world's dark inside one body so that strangers could keep their son. And not one of them ever knew your name, or thanked you, or wondered if you were lonely. That's not a debt, Severin. That's the most love anyone has ever shown a world that gave him nothing back. You don't owe the dark your life. You've already paid it 100 times over every single night for 300 years. She kissed him, once, soft, on his cold gray mouth, and felt the faintest warmth answer beneath it. So, put it down, please. Let her go. Let yourself go, and stay with me instead. For a long, suspended moment, nothing moved in all that dark. Then, Severin reached up with one shaking hand and laid it over the small gray hands on his knees, and said, in a voice 3 centuries old, and finally, breaking open, I'm sorry, Senna. I have been so sorry for so long. You can rest now, I'll be all right. A pause, and then the truest thing he had ever said. I'm not coming with you. I want to stay. The thing wearing his sister's face looked up at him. And for just an instant, Ira would never be sure after whether she imagined it. The gray mask softened into a real little girl's smile, relieved and loving and free, before she dissolved into the falling ash-like breath on a winter morning and was gone. The hush broke. All across the gray waste of it, the standing figures turned, the soldiers, the lost, the long rows of patient gray children, 200 years of Sunhold's stolen heirs, and one by one they lifted their faces, and the wind that had worn them down for centuries finally carried them up instead of away, dissolving them gently into a dark that was no longer hungry, that was at last only empty and quiet and done. The Wayne did not have to be fed because the wound it lived in had closed. You cannot poison a thing that has forgiven itself. Severin gasped like a drowning man breaking the surface, and the gold light rushed up to meet him, and Ira caught him as he fell forward off the throne into her arms. You came back, he said into her hair shaking. I ordered you not to. I ordered you. Yes, well. Ira held him as tight as her belly would allow, laughing and crying at once. I'm a foundling and a runaway and the worst Luna in the history of either kingdom, and I have never once in my life done what a king told me to. You'll have to get used to it. He pulled back just far enough to look at her, and the wonder on his face was almost too much to bear. The bond between them, half taken and aching for days, sang now like a struck bell, and when he lowered his head to the curve of her throat, when she felt the question in it and answered by baring it to him, the mating bite was not a wound, but a homecoming, the bond snapping fully and finally into place. Gold and shadow, braided together at last into something neither could be alone. She felt it settle in her chest, warm and complete and right. She bit him back, and felt his ragged groan against her skin, and felt the new thread between them pulled tight and hold, an anchor now, a tether of living light driven down into the heart of a king who would never again have to hold the dark by himself. Far above the black spires for the first time in 300 years, the eastern sky began, very faintly, to pale toward gold. By dawn, Aldrich had lost his Luna forever. The word reached Sunhold a week later, carried by no messenger anyone could name. The Wayne was simply gone. The gray country greening, the dark that had threatened the borderlands for 200 years, lifted as though it had never been. The Pact of Ash was ended. There would be no more stolen heirs, no more secret griefs carried south in the night, because there was no longer any dark to feed. Sunhold was safe, completely and finally, in the one way Aldrich had never dared hope it could be, and the cost of that safety, he understood, was the thing he had been too afraid to fight for. His Luna was alive, and she had stayed in Duskmere, not as a captive, not as a payment, but as a queen, wanted at last, by someone for no reason except herself. Aldrich grieved her. He had loved her, in his careful, arithmetic way, but he was not, underneath the king, a cruel man, and beneath the grief he found it in himself to be glad for someone who had finally walked out of the cold. He ruled a kingdom that would never again give up its children, and each spring he sent a single crate of small, bitter southern oranges east across the border, never once receiving a reply and never once stopping. Eira's son was born at the first true sunrise Duskmere had seen in 3 centuries. They named him for no one, not for a bloodline, not for a pact, not for a duty he was born to pay, only for himself, a small new person who belonged to no kingdom's arithmetic and never would. Orsa delivered him and pronounced him, with deep suspicion, loud and rude, and far too pleased with himself, your son. Beyond any doubt, Tovar wept openly and denied it to everyone. Now, in the warm dark of a chamber, where a fire was always lit, Eira woke to pale gold morning, spilling through a south window that no longer had to be pried open. Her son slept in the crook of one arm, and Severin slept on her other side. Slept, deep and easy and without fear, one heavy arm thrown across them, both as though he had finally, after 300 years, found a dark, gentle enough to allow it. No, hush, waited to pull him under. No wind, no ash, no gray and patient children, only the morning, the fire, and the small loud breathing of a child who would never be given to anyone. Eira watched the sunrise touch his face, and the man who had once been the most feared being in the living world smiled in his sleep, and she settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and let the dawn keep them.